Welcome, friends and family. It is Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you will be freer after this hour with us than you were when we began. Today, we are talking about the dividing lines of education. So many of our children are redlined into school districts where they are assigned by their residential address, and that creates a massive sorting system in the United States that has prevented our kids from having equal opportunity in education, equal opportunity to learn, equal access to high quality teachers and teaching and materials and resources and facilities. If there was anything ever that we could call systemically racist, it's the United States public education system, and it's by design. It was designed many years ago, built on the housing patterns from a federal government program, housing program that came out of the New Deal era of all things. We're going to talk about it today. I got my experts with me. I come with backup. So you better back up if you don't want the truth. We're about to start. Here we go, right after this. Well, good morning, fam. Everybody's in the house. How y'all doing?
Good. Good morning. Good morning. Good to see you.
Good morning.
Good morning, Dr. Katera Moore. I feel like I should make an intro here, just basically so people to say when I say we come with backup, especially with Sharif's network, it is so deep that Sharif will make a call and we will get somebody on quickly to help us unpack an issue. Today we have Dr. Katera Moore with us. Sharif, do you want to give?
I give a quick intro.
Yes, a quick intro here.
Yeah, Dr. Katera Moore is a geographer, a Black geographer. Tell me how many of them you got in your Rolodex, So for her to be, and if you know anything about like human geography and the study of just macro people, landmass, oppression, racism, as it's been used in that space, she's the expert for you. She's an educator, college professor, and just a dope person all around. So I'm pleased to have our sister, Dr. Katera Moore, on the show today to help us, as you said, unpack this report that was pretty dense and but also enlightening, and it just reinforced so much of the things that we've talked about for years, Chris.
I'm going to put a link to it in the comments for people listening and watching. There's a report called Dividing Lines from the Urban Institute. I don't want to say that report is the sole frame for how we should be thinking or talking about it. It's a starting point for talking about it. But there's so much more information, and I hope we get some resources out of you all, Dr. Moore and Sharif, any other resources that you think would make our audience smarter about the issue. Let's give them that too. But we'll just say this Dividing Lines report is a beginning place, right? But in some ways, it feels like we've heard this before. And my response to it as a layperson who's not a geography person, I'm not a quant, whatever, is why are we still talking about this? Why is it still an issue? We have all this progressive activity around education for decades. And this is the one thing that they forgot to get back to, is looking at the lines and the boundaries of how schools operate. So can either you help me understand why we're still talking about this in 2021 when this feels like an old problem? This feels like a 1970s problem or 80s problem.
I was just about to say, go ahead, Katera, you covered
up. She's like, I don't want to say.
Sorry, I'm in public, so I had to step aside.
Somebody walk by you.
But
I feel you.
I think the thing is that they haven't forgotten about this. These maps that were drawn in the 1930s leave a legacy today, right? So, this is like residential segregation is the foundation for a lot of this inequality. It's not, now people are starting to look at these maps, these residential security maps, and they're seeing that, oh, it's the same places where there's gun violence. Oh, it's the same places where you see lots of gentrification. It's the same places where you see inequities in schools. And so these maps were drawn. I mean, this is, our housing system, right? This the wealth gap. It all comes from these maps where, you have federal housing association, and it's like house residentially secure these neighborhoods. And when you look at the maps, they are is egregious, right? So the most residentially insecure neighborhoods were the ones where there were colored, infiltration of Negroes, foreign born, and deteriorating housing stock, and they became the places where there was going to be no further investment. And so that kind of set the stage for where we are now, right? It became a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So it's like, there goes the neighborhood, because in fact, that's what happened, right? So there was no investment. You couldn't get a mortgage or any funds for houses that were in these neighborhoods that were deemed red. So red were the color of the lines. Green lines were where you found more white people, professional. So all of this was about. I apologize for the background noise. All of this was about who lived in a place, what was their occupation, and then what was the quality of the housing stock. And so that started in the 30s, when mortgages were not available to Black people, but it kind of really began where white people had access to all this wealth, because now, instead of having a mortgage over 10 years with a balloon payment, now you have 30 years to buy a house. And so you had this rapid suburbanization and disinvestment in urban areas. And so here we are now, right? And so this kind of how schools are funded is all still based on this. How are, is all funded by property taxes. And so when you have segregation embedded in the landscape, and you have school funding as that comes out of that, then of course you're going to have inequities, right? And so a lot of this progressiveness is not really, that's why it all kind of comes back to um, economic and residential inequality, all these issues that progressives are now discussing, because it's where people live, right? And that kind of seals your fate because of all these kind of historical processes, right? So that's why schools are unequal, because the land, like literally the landscape is unequal by design. And if you look at these maps in the 19, in Philadelphia, it was Brewer, right? So, you look at any post-industrial city, you'll see these maps in like Milwaukee, Baltimore, anywhere. And it's just, you're looking at the maps and like, you just can't believe that they wrote this stuff about people. Like they literally went door to door, wrote down who's living there, who's infiltrating, and, what kind of, what they assessed the place to be. And then that's what it became.
What's so interesting about that, though, is for me, is that like you have had all these years of urban planning and urban planners, and you have mayors that come in and they have urban planners. And so you have people who know everything that we're saying right now. It doesn't feel like the public understands the technical information that, about how these boundary lines are drawn, but the people that we elect do. And I just have not seen a widespread effort to try and redraw lines or to erase lines. Am I missing something? Have you all seen some efforts over time to try and elevate this as the issue? Like, because this is the map of systemic inequality. Like we can see it; it's physical. So, any place where you have something so tangible, you would think policy people would be working on it. Have there been, in your mind, any efforts locally or nationally to redraw the lines, erase them, to make them more equitable?
Yes, I'm sorry. So yes, there have been people, because everybody's talking about this now. Everybody's talking about what the legacy of redlining has been. So we're seeing now. So theoretically, the Community Reinvestment Act was supposed to undo the damage caused by redlining. You have where you have banks were supposed to now put money into these neighborhoods, but what a lot of them did was they put money into neighborhoods by way of check cashing places instead of full-fledged banks. And so now what you're seeing is that people are kind of saying, this is the legacy of redlining. What are we going to do about it? We need to invest in these communities that were previously redlined in order to undo this damage. But you literally have, um, we're talking decades of disinvestment, decades of So it's like the neighborhoods that decline. And now what's happening is it's become the frontier, yet a new frontier for white people to come in and gentrify it. So people are talking about it, but you really would truly need massive influxes of money. And so some of the infrastructure, that's kind of some of this infrastructure, this bill could potentially address some of these things in terms of shoring up communities, but it's like you need to do it from all angles, right? It's, it's not just housing, it's not just schools, it's like all the things that come with a neighborhood that has been intentionally disinvested for, like, what is that, 90 years, like 80 years. And so that's kind of what we're dealing with. That's what we are now.
Yeah, I mean, I was just wondering, Chris, to that question, whether it was a matter of people. Yes, I think people have talked about it over the years, but I think their answer is like, oh, we need to invest, we need to bring money, and so we're going to take that from you. You had to be there this entire time. Now we're going to move you out, and we're going to gentrify it. So their answer to redlining seems to be gentrification. And so, like, here's the investment, but it's going to displace you. And we're going to bring in some other folks, and we're going to, as we're doing this, you know what? We're actually going to widen the wealth gap, in this process. We're not going to try to mitigate. We're not going to try to address it. We're going to actually widen it, because now we're going to do this gentrification process. We're going to give you 10 years of tax-free living, but we're going to tax the other folks, the working poor, who can't afford to stay there, who can't get the loans to fix it up, to invest in it, to open up shops. We're not going to do any of that. And so then I also think about, like, have I seen, some things? It's like when I hear about urban renewal in Philly, a lot of times it's about downtown. I'm like, wait a minute, what about other places? And you see this massive investment in what downtown looks like. Because when they were unhappy with what Center City looks like, and the tourism industry and what that might cost, or the entertainment industry with the stadiums, they found money. But when you're talking about my grandmother's home over in the Logan Nicetown section, they said, that your houses in this whole neighborhood is sinking. This was in the 80s when I was in high school. And they told my grandmother, oh yeah, we're going to have to move you out at some point. We're going to have to buy your house and tear it down, blah, blah. Those people are still, they tore down some parts, other parts, and it's not been redeveloped. So it's just like vacant lots, like no investment in it, no nothing. And I get like, oh, the land may be unstable, but you can't tell me there's nothing. You can't even build a park there. You can't even you can't do anything with it. So it's just like, what happens when it's just like a vacant lot? What happens to that space when people can't, don't have the funds and the capital themselves, and then also not getting support? And so you can just imagine blocks and blocks and blocks of neighborhoods. Across the street from my grandmother's house, that's torn down. And her block, they're still there. Then another further block, that's torn down. Then as you and Katera mentioned, when you overlay that with the maps of the schools, that's the same school that my grandmother wouldn't put her 6 kids in years ago,
You raise some really good points when this idea of urban renewal. And so this is why I guess it probably was in the 80s where Neil Smith, he was a critical geographer, wrote about gentrification as the new urban frontier, right? So when you think about this frontier where white people were able to kind of just get land all across the nation, urban areas became that because of
it's a new version of Manifest Destiny westward expansion, right?
It's exactly that, right? Because all these tools, right? So what created the urban renewal was this redlining, right? So you created a space where we, this tear down and rebuild that was always focused on the downtown, right? So that's what you're saying. Like, so what happened in Philadelphia, and then Cleveland, Ohio, I think was probably the largest urban renewal area where federal dollars you were able to use that to if the city invested these federal dollars, then the federal government paid more money. So you were able to kind of get the downtown built up at the expense of the neighborhoods. And then what happened, it was this Section 112 of the Federal Housing Act that that's why we have so many eds and meds in certain places, because it enabled them to now hospitals and universities could invest. And then this is why you see, in Philadelphia, the way that, the University City looks, and Temple's campus. You look in Cleveland, like it's just massive. And you read the articles from back then, it was like, if you remove the Negro element, you will get more research dollars into your institution. You will attract more white people. And so even in Philadelphia, you look at the newspaper articles when they were taking Society Hill, and we all know that Society Hill was a Black community because of the work that Du Bois did. And it was like, we need more white people to invest. And that's what they did. And so when you had during urban renewal time, the first kind of frontier, and we're seeing it now. And this is a frontier now, right? White people can come into these neighborhoods and get property for almost nothing. And like you said, and we lay out the red carpet. Oh, you're not going to pay taxes, and we're going to displace people. So you displace people, not just their housing, but it's their whole social structure, right? So the lady that was down the street that was helping you watch your kids, now you're disrupted from that. The way that you were getting to work, because they remake, and this is what colonization is, right? It's like it comes from the animal kingdom, like insects colonize an area for them, right? And so when you see what happens with gentrification, right now, there's a coffee shop, now there's a dog park, now it's all the things for the new people, and Black person or long-term resident, that you're not welcome there. And we saw that. Like we saw that when the guy was barbecuing in the park in California, and the lady told him, "Oh, you can't barbecue. Like you just got here. Like how do you know what I can do in my community?" And so that's what happens, right? So people get displaced, and then sometimes you do see, like, once the people that come in, the gentrifiers come in, maybe the schools start creeping up a little bit, but guess what? It's not for the people that were already there. Like they make it for themselves while displaced. And so for the city, it's great, right? Because when you look at new census data, like over, like in the next 10 years, you're going to see higher rates of income, higher rates of home ownership, less crime, higher rates of education. All of this stuff is going to be great. But what about the people that got displaced? And where are they? So then you're going to see more pockets of more intense poverty and decline because they just got shifted somewhere else. And all of these areas, all this gentrification, all this stuff is in the same place of where these redlining maps are. So it's this legacy like literally continues, and it continues to enable some people to gain wealth and some people to lose it, right? So Black people are losing houses at astronomical rates for like nothing, right? It's like these people are losing houses for $5,000, or being talked out their houses because there's all this predatory extraction of Black wealth. Like the last vestige that people have is maybe a home that they, their parents left them or whatever. And the stuff is very, it's predatory, and then also we see in some of these areas where you had a lot of predatory lending during the time of, before the housing bubble, where people were refinancing at these very high interest rates. And so all of this to say is that now here's the other kicker, right? So people get to come in, and we just said that they're not paying taxes. In the city of Philadelphia, it's like, why is there even tax abatement? Like this,
starving.
You need money,
Poor
money,
big
money.
city, right? Yeah.
But people can come in with all this wealth and not pay a tax. And so it's like, it's insane. It's like, so now you kind of just, it's because it's like, the thing about it is that the reality of the situation is that some of this stuff is money, but some of the stuff is will, right? And so the fact of the matter is, because you can find money for what you want to find money for, right? You can pull money out of a hat and redo the Kimball Center. You can do all this stuff. You can pull money from anywhere and say, oh, we're going to pay, but you're going to pay for what's valued. And what we know that's undervalued is people that live in communities that were determined to be residentially insecure in the 1930s and 40s. So there's no value there. There's no value there of the people. There's no value of the landscape. There's no value of the housing stock until white people say, oh, there's value for us, not for them. And so that's why the schools in these same areas are just failing for no reason, like other than disinvestment, intentional disinvestment. It's not by chance. Like none of this is like by chance. Like it just so happened. And that's what they try to use, like even with environmental justice. It's like, oh, we only put the toxic waste facility there because the land was cheap. Why is the land cheap? The land's cheap because Black people live there and because you devalued the land.
There's that book years ago about how what is it? How colonial something underdeveloped Africa what's the name of that book? It's how Europe underdeveloped
underdeveloped
Africa or something
or
like
something
that.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like you would have the same book that you could write about how white America underdeveloped Black America on purpose, like, on purpose. Like, so we're having all these national discussions right now at the moment about whether or not racism is systemic. When I say we, I don't think we. I just think that there is a discussion being had nationally about, well, I don't
There's
think
only
there's
mean individuals. There's no system.
there's no system. It's not
Yeah.
systemic. It's just, and that makes it easier when you say that these things are just individual prejudice and you focus on that and individual instances of racism. That stops you from the real serious analysis of how these things are on autopilot because of systems. They're on autopilot because they've been written into documents, and now I think that there's an effort to not have us teach that to kids, not have us learn about it, how they're systemic. No, it's just individual racism. And are you calling me a racist? No, I'm not calling you a racist. I'm calling the system that has benefited your butt racist. And you know that too, like I do. It's like a life insurance policy that keeps paying to you year after year after year and generation. And you trying to act like that policy doesn't exist. Oh, no, I don't know where that policy is. It must be in a lockbox somewhere from a long time ago. No. Let me show you where it is. Let me help you understand, because apparently you don't. So this is something we've been talking about the 1930s. We've talked a little bit, so far in this conversation about, how old this is, and it was, embedded in programs. This helps us understand it's systemic. The Homeowners Loan Corporation from the 1940s era programs, New Deal era programs, did a lot to help locations and cities and others determine what is and isn't a good place to live and where investments should go, where money should follow. So if you are living in a historically underinvested neighborhood, it is not by accident, it's by design. And it's not in one city, it's in all cities, and it's in most places. And your government did this. So let's talk about just this one snippet of one of these homeowner loan corporation maps that was documenting the Black population of the Maywood neighborhood of Illinois. And, it gives you a description and a characteristic that tells you whether or not you should invest in Maywood, where Black people live. And it starts out saying this is an old and shabby neighborhood situated about the center village. And towards the end, it says the area is of mixed and rather poor appearance and unlikely to improve, very much due to age and low grade population, of which considerable portion are Negroes. This is fourth grade, which is a lower grade, because of poor prospects and undesirable population. So there's a mix here, and I'm not going to be articulate enough to say it, but that ties melanin to land to wealth, right? There's a set of things here, and that concoction of things persists beyond 1940 on after that and is never corrected.
Mm-hmm.
I shouldn't say never corrected, because Dr. Moore, maybe you can tell me if there was a period maybe in the 60s or the 50s or the 70s or the 80s where there were some course corrections, or maybe there's a HUD program that tried to change this, but I don't know of any serious attempts to dislocate or decouple race, land, and wealth from each other. I can't hear you. I don't know if you're on.
Okay. Yes.
There you are.
I'm sorry, I switched to my computer. But in some ways, there was a poor attempt at this, right? So if you look at Hope 6, I mean, I don't know, what part of the country you're in, but there were in the 2000, there was all this kind of tear down and rebuild. They tore down a lot of the high rise public housing projects in the city, and then built this kind of suburban style housing that was supposed to be mixed income or whatever. So there was no concentration of poverty, but it was the same thing. Like what they did was they displaced a lot of people. So theoretically there were houses for sale, houses for rent, and then they did some scattered site development, but they disrupted all these social structures. And so that happened in, like I said, the 2000, that was like the next iteration of urban renewal. But the kicker is that we still have now where like a lot of these. So one thing that happened with urban renewal is that you had blight certification. So in order to do urban renewal, the place had to be certified as blighted, whatever. And so a lot of that blight certification from like the 40s and 50s is what they're still using now to change some of these communities, right? So they're still carrying on the same blight certification because it was the creation of these redevelopment authorities. And probably the most successful redevelopment authority was actually a community in Roxbury in the Boston area that became their own redevelopment authority and used the powers of eminent domain to shape the community in their own image, right? And so you have that kind of as a, and to this day, they're continuing a lot of the economic development. But what ends up happening is that economic development frequently comes at the expense of people development, right? So you're focused on the built environment and not the social or human environment, and you see that a lot with some of these processes. So that was like probably the biggest mass investment, and theoretically, the Section 8 voucher program is supposed to be there, right? Because, there's a kind of home ownership caveat in that where a person can kind of convert their voucher into a home, but like not many people know about that or are able to kind of access that, right? So it kind of keeps you kind of mired in this kind of not building wealth kind of thing. So there are these kind of programs that kind of happen and they kind of go from administration to administration, or you get stuck with some, poor laws like how we have here in Philadelphia that allow for it really to be the wild, wild west with all this tear down and rebuild, like even to the point where there was in a gentrified area where they had tore down, they had rebuilt the house. The 10-year tax abatement has ended. They're tearing down that house and building again to get another 10 years. It's like a $700,000 house. And so we see that a lot, right? And then what ends up happening in these communities, if we take it back to schools, are either at some point you'll see the new people kind of be able to kind of take over a school, right? They come into a school, they start making demands, the school changes, and some other kids get forced out, the kids that were always there. Or they completely opt out and they just kind of moved into the neighborhood for all the amenities, and then they put their kids in private schools. So people still continue to, there's still this kind of, this inequality, even from when the neighborhood gentrifies, because it literally sucks to be you if you are Black in one of these communities for the long term, right? Because you don't. I mean, and then the thing, if we take it back again to the maps, and if you look at these same periods of time, like if a Black person bought, let's say whatever, like take it from the 70s, you bought a house in one of these red line areas, and a white person bought a comparable house or something where they had access to purchase a house at, and you look over the period of time, the amount that those houses have appreciated, like a house in one of these areas, maybe you got paid 30 grand for it in 1970, and now it's gotten up to 200,000. In a white neighborhood that had more access, they might have paid 40, 50 grand for a house in the same period of time. And that house might be worth $1 million because it is appreciated. And so it's all these things. And they're like living in the best district in the country. Because we take Lower Merion, top of the line district. But a lot of those houses, even in the 90s, some of those houses were only $200,000. And now we're talking $1 million homes in the top performing district over the same time frame that we have here in the city of Philadelphia. And so that's, these maps, like, again, it embedded this inequality into the landscape and into everybody's life. Like, so it's not just where you live. Like, you remember how Barack Obama would say, like, oh, your zip code shouldn't determine your outcomes, but it literally does, right? Because it's going to determine what kind of, what's your education, what kind of quality of education you want to get, because what school you're going to be able to go to. It's going to determine maybe what kind of jobs you have access to, right? Because just being connected to these kind of employment kind of networks, it's going to determine maybe your health outcomes, right? Because we can take the same maps about health outcomes and overlay it on these red line maps and see the same thing. So it's almost like, if you, so like for, it's like this thing called the Human Development Index that we kind of that the UN looks at globally to determine how developed and how advanced a society is. And the United States always fares well because it's the United States. But if you kind of hone in on these cities, these post-industrial cities, our stuff is looking a lot like sub-Saharan Africa, right? It's the same thing in terms of education, birth rates and health outcomes and all of that stuff. It's literally the same. And it's like these lining maps. And it's like, it's almost as if, we've seen success stories after this point, right? For Black communities where you had in the 60s, like thriving Black communities that were segregated, that may have been redlined, but we were able to kind of invest in ourselves, right? You had the Black Banks, you had whatever, and then the whole thing fell apart. Can
you talk a little bit on that one point? About it's very much like the Black Wall Street thing, where you build something up and then they come along and they tear it down. There was a period of time, and help me if you know, because I don't know what era it was exactly with the highway system, though. I know here in Minnesota, like in St. Paul, the very dominant Black segregated community was in the Rondo community of St. Paul. And in Rondo, they built up Victorian houses and their own systems of everything. They had everything from plumbers to lawyers to doctors to everything living in one area. And it was an area that previously had not been considered like valuable land or whatever, a valuable place to live, and they made something out of it. They built and then came the time to put the highway system into Minnesota, and they ran a freeway right through the middle of that, not to the side of it, not to the left of it, not to the right of it, not whatever, right straight up the middle of the main street of that community and bust it up, right? And I can't remember what era it was, but we were taught that happened in more than Rondo, that it happened in many places at the same time. Right.
That was the plan, right? So they call highway renewal Negro removal, right? And so this kind of it's all part of urban renewal. And so when you look at the highways, right? So theoretically, the highways was like the biggest infrastructure project in the nation because it was able to move goods. It was supposed to help the military. It was all these things. But if you walk around, like actually I was in Minneapolis, I guess a few years ago for a conference. And so anytime I go to a city, I go for a walk. And because you can always see the legacy of urban renewal somewhere. If you're trying to walk on foot and pass a highway where it looks like the neighborhood is disjointed, yes, that was by design. That they ran a highway through somewhere. Philadelphia, we had the Vine Street Expressway that kind of wiped out the Chinese population. We have a lot of these highways, like you see, like you go to Camden, New Jersey. Why is Camden like the way it is? It's because of 676. It's like these highways were to wipe, literally to wipe people out. And I think the most well documented, it wasn't to wipe out Black people, but it was to wipe out Jews in New York. Robert Moses, when they were doing the Cross Bronx parkways, and the thing about it, the thing that highways do is it's all about the downtown, right? So what highways have done, it connects suburban people to the central business district, right? So it's always a way to kind of get people into a place quickly, right? And so you kind of, you also have in our area,
and without seeing anybody,
right? They never see it. Like it's just like you just kind of go through. Same thing with the rail lines and that kind of thing. And so they, you get them through. And so what Robert Moses did was, while he was building these highways to get people from Westchester County into New York, it was like he curved it just enough. You know what? He didn't have to, but it was like, while I'm at it, let's just wipe out this neighborhood that we don't want to be there anyway. And so you see that in many communities, like literally anywhere when you see a highway, if you kind of, look the previous decade of when that highway was constructed, you will see that there was probably a thriving Black community. And now what we're seeing, I can't think, I just saw an article in some I can't think of what city it was, but they're trying to figure out how to undo that, right? How to kind of create, this kind of connectivity. Like even in Wilmington, Delaware, like, it's like they separated it. And so some places are trying to figure out how to create like some type of park system, how to kind of redirect traffic or whatever, because these things it's this big infrastructure. And Philadelphia did it too, right? So we have I-95 that kind of runs through, alongside our waterfront. And it basically was designed, again, like I said, there was a Black community in Society Hill, which is right there next to the waterfront. But this was designed to kind of wipe out all these land uses that they thought were invaluable. But now what they're seeing, and this happened around waterfronts all over the country, to get the Black people out, but they played themselves, right? Because it's like, shoot, our waterfront is disconnected from our city, and now it's an amenity, right? Because these are no longer working waterfronts. These are going to be something where, it's like, how do we reconnect this, right? And so, but now, again, like, who gets to decide how we're going to reconnect it? And then they're going to reconnect it as an amenity for whom? Right. And so we know that because of the redlining, because of the highways, because of the racialized space, like Black people know where you're supposed to be. Like nobody even has to tell you, like, no niggers allowed down here, right? It's like they know it by the way space is demarcated, and that's what they're continuing to do.
I mean, do we even need to keep having this conversation about whether or not it's systemic? It just blows my mind, right? Like we're being gaslit.
Yeah,
it's like the best gaslighting ever.
Who built that stuff, right? Who had the capital to build, like, straight? You know what I mean? I was watching a show the other day, having a conversation of this professor was having with a white audience, right? She's like, how many people believe there's white racism, and how many? What about Black racism? They raise their hand. It's just like, how does white racism impact Black people? And this is all white audience. They're like, oh, housing. Oh, banking. Oh, education. Oh, law enforcement. Like they're like naming all. She's like, yeah, we could probably go on this list forever. She's like, all right, now tell me about this Black racism that y'all were talking about. How do Black people impact white folks? And they were like, we afraid of them. You know what I mean? Like they just like, yeah. So fear. So you're afraid of them. You keep them out. You do this and that. But ultimately, who really should be afraid? Who really should be afraid of your wealth that you wield, the weapons that you wield, the laws and policies that you wield? It doesn't make sense. But yeah, let's continue to say that there's nothing about the system that's been created.
It's just personal, individual. And this is where we do our own selves. Like when we get, onto cancel fever and we're trying to cancel individuals for individual acts of racism or whatnot, I understand it and it makes sense to me. It doesn't make sense that be our primary focus, because we've got some systemic stuff that if we unwound this, it wouldn't matter how individuals were acting on a one-to-one basis. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's millions of individuals,
We'll vote on that, but won't vote to get some joker out of office. Like, we'll vote to cancel on social media, but we won't bring that same energy to the polls, or a referendum or things like that.
I'm looking at something here from the National Association of Real Estate Boards Ethics Handbook 1924. A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. This is, so I don't know if I said that too fast, but basically you guys catch the gist of, you should not sell houses to people who by their presence will lower the property values. And we know that from the previous quote that meant people of color, specifically Black folks. So we are tying property values and wealth and money. So we're making white skin a premium is what we're doing. So we're prioritizing, not prioritizing, we're making whiteness a property. It's a property. It's a physical thing. It's a manifestation of wealth, a thing. So when you introduce us to anything, so just our presence, our being, who we are, actually is meant to not be wealthy. It's not to be tied to the thing that generates the most wealth in the United States, and not just generates the wealth, ties it from generation to generation to generation. So, because mom or dad dies with the house that they bought in the 40s. And that house, you sell it in the 70s or the 80s, and then you make 4 times or 5 times what they paid for it, and then you buy your own house, And then, rinse, wash, repeat. You do that for your kids. But what I find so interesting about the school part of this, though, is that you're not just making white skin a bankable property. You're making white children a priority by making their schools designed to be within the wealth hoarding zones. So you're making white children a premium, which I think we should all pay attention to right now, because their schools are going to get the best of investments and everything. They're going to have the best services and amenities around them at all times. They're probably going to have the best attitudes in life because they're living in opportunity hoarding zones, right? But even things like policy today, when we're talking about CRT and these things, that was 100% based on no white child should ever feel uncomfortable in their class. They should never go to class and have a lesson that makes them feel uncomfortable about themselves or teaches them any of the stuff we're talking about right now. Right? So for children to be the location of our systemic racism and inequality shows you how it reproduces over years, over years, and over years. So for me, I'm going to ask you guys if you think this is, one solution to me seems attack the borders, attack the borders, attack the borders. You can attack a lot of things, the achievement gap, the teacher prep gap. You can attack a lot of things, and let's keep doing that. But if you're never attacking the way that the boundary lines are drawn in school districts, you're never going to decouple the white skin premium in education and in wealth building from the system. You're going to just keep perpetuating and trying to build a charter school in a redlined area, for instance, or whatnot, which isn't a bad thing to do. Listen, it's not a bad thing to do. But if you can unredline the area and the district and remove the premium of wealth, property, and skin color, you might be doing more.
That's a good point, because it just actually made me think of gerrymandering, and people talk about that with the census, right? Because they start redrawing lines. But if you've ever seen some of these catchment areas for these special admission schools, it's like, it's not even, it's gerrymandered, right? So it's like here in Philadelphia is, the Penn Alexander School, people, it raised the price of houses like to $500,000-$600,000 for a row home in Philadelphia. But the lines were like drawn down one side of the block, on this half of the block. It was like
like my little 5-year-old scribble scrabble, right? That's what it was. I'm like, she did that? How'd you get in that office? Like,
it's just crazy. And so it was like, because they were trying to cut people out, right? Because at the time, there were parts of what's now University City that had been deteriorated. And so it's like, let's see how we can cut these people out. And so you look at some of these school catchment areas, or in Philadelphia, where some of the better schools, they have this racial balance. Like, if you like the Powell School, right? That's the school in Powelton Village that's now getting a brand new building. While the rest of the schools are suffering from environmental decline, but that's another story for another day. But like, if you can only be Black if you live in that area, anybody can transfer in, but you can't be Black, because they're trying to keep a racial balance, right? And so, because Powelton Village at one point was like a Black community, and it's now it's not. And so we're seeing that, like, and then when you're looking at, like, what was it? 3 years ago, I guess now, what SLA and Ben Franklin, right? With a lot of these environmental problems in the schools, it wasn't until the SLA kids, which were the kids that were in a special admission school, white kids, came to the school, that now all of a sudden, you have some environmental hazards, some asbestos we need to kind of remove. We'll do that now. But when it was just the Black kids, nobody was interested, right? And so we've seen that time and time again, not just in terms of the quality of education, but literally the quality of the physical plant of a school building. And so where you have kids' health at stake for, long-term impacts, right? And so again, and this ties to where you are and the kind of mobility that you have, because that's the other thing too. Like, when you're locked into a residential area like this, your mobility is severely limited. And I think that a lot of city planners and geographers have looked at this, like, what is a person's activity space? Like, a lot of people are only going to be moving within a few blocks of their home, or with X amount of miles or time. And so that kind of keeps you in all of these hazards, right? Not, it's the school, it's like all of the things. And so it really does come down to where you're born. Like, it really is going to determine your life outcomes, because it's, your housing sucks, the opportunities are horrible, the school you go to, nobody, wants you to learn. It might be falling apart. It might be mold, lead, it's all these things. The books are old. There's no librarian. There's no guidance counselor. So you don't even find out about the opportunities. It's all the worst case scenarios. And you're right. And it kind of ties into really housing, right? It's like literally this residential segregation that we're trying to pretend that doesn't exist in this country anymore because we have integration, is the thing that keeps Black people oppressed. It's because you live in these communities that there's people have just written off because nobody even has to see this stuff. Like we're all this gun violence. White people aren't driving through there because the main roads, like Lancaster Avenue or even Haverford Avenue or whatever, or the highway or the regional rail line does not take you through the hood. So you're never going to.
They don't see it, but we do see it.
Right.
So I think some of it might be our focus. What do we focus on as the big levers that we want to pull to make change? And I think in previous generations of activism and in civil rights work and whatnot, people had to sit around and say, what are we going to lift up as the main things we're going to attack? What parts of the system are we going to attack? And I feel like they did a very good job, like in the past. I feel like we might be in a more confused state now about what are the big things we should be attacking. I mean, you mentioned gerrymandering. There needs to be a full-scale assault on educational gerrymandering. Like we're fighting for all kinds of other stuff in education or whatnot, but we're not fighting the very thing that is assigning us to inferior conditions, right? Yeah. Seems like a big thing to fight. Don't get me wrong on the criminal justice stuff. I think it's important, but I think if you're going after individual police shootings rather than what you just said, like your health outcomes, the water you drink, the lead you have in your system, your kids are being given so much lead in their water that they can't be remediated, and it's increasing special education needs in some communities by 300, 400, 500%. I think an individual police shooting is very important to pay attention to, but I also think the poisoning of your entire system of children is equally as important, and that is coming from the gerrymandering that continues, the redlining, gerrymandering, the systems, the boundaries, the places. Your place is being designed for you. That you didn't just end up in that place by accident. This isn't just your zip code. And I would like to refine this thing about your zip code determines your outcomes. I think your outcomes are determined a lot by what you take agency to do also in life, but I do think your zip code determines the investments that are made in you. Mm-hmm. And the challenges you're going to have. You tell me your zip code, I can tell you some smart person can tell you. Yeah, some smart person can tell you in this zip code, this is what the investment's going to be, and this is what the challenges are going to be. Now, what you do with it is up to you, right? Like go ahead, Sharif. I see you jumping in.
No. I mean, I think it's right on that thread. I stopped because I wanted you to finish that thought, because I think it probably could be a very just an analysis of, as you said, some smart folks were like, here's the investment. It's minuscule. Here's the agency that you're going to have to exude. Like, here's how much on your game you're going to have to be. If you're in this zip code, it's so much investment. Like, you could be, you could be an okay parent. You could be like whatever. In this one, man, you better bring it. You better bring it with your aunts and uncles and grandparents and everybody better be all in on supporting that child, because your safety net is nil, and then the other one, yeah, you could be a little lackadaisical. You could take more risk. You could be more, like, oh, let me just go explore. Let my kid explore. Where the other one, and it goes back to, I think it even connects to Hillary Beard's work around parenting. Like, hey, in this one, yeah, if you are a little lackadaisical, she did that quadrant of, and for Black girls, for example, any parenting besides neglectful can be okay. Like but for Black boys, the best one to be is authoritative. A strict authoritative is what's going to happen, right? And so if there's some similar quadrant for, as you just described, of low investment, and then here's the parenting and communal style that's going to be most effective, because the output is just going to be crazy. And I think that also adds to, and here's what your racial stress level is going to be, because that type of vigilance, all the time hypervigilance, it has an impact on you, because as a human being, that's not how it's supposed to be, because it's supposed to be a communal experience. Being in society, being in community, being united in the thinking about the value of a child. But if you're in hostile territory, which we are as Black people in America, like, you don't get that luxury. You better be vigilant. And yes, that means adding the racial stress to your to the levels of your bloodstream, to your psyche, and to your whole existence.
I actually believe this is the conversation to be having right now, right? Like our mind state, you just said psyche of our existence, all of that stuff is connected deeply to this weird combination of land, boundaries, rules, whatever, and that's the system. These are systemic things. So I think our movement should be about systemic things. I think our strategy should be about systemic things. I'm looking for answers too, solutions. So I want to point our attention to this this proposal. It was a study, and it's a proposal, and it's and here's an article about it from Dr. Preston Green and Dr. Bruce Baker. These are two people that focus on school finance and how school finance is inequitable. That's like 100% of their scholarship. This one is about how reparations can be paid through school finance reform. I think there's some novel recommendations in here, but I have questions. As a layperson, I'm not a scholar. I have some questions. The first one that they recommend taking a look to is, first of all, let's set it up. They're making the claim up front that that there have been funding disparities that go all the way back to the separate but equal era, and that segregation has found its way into school finance also. So that's in keeping with everything we've already said. Property taxes, school funding, race. You mix them all together, you get an inequitable system. One of the corrections that they would call for is tax rebates to homeowners who lived in previously segregated areas where their home values were impacted and reduced because of segregation and redlining. That created something of a black tax for homeowners. So their reversal of that would be to say that we recommend direct rebates to Black homeowners in previously redlined or otherwise segregated communities in the amount to cover the black tax, like what could have been considered the black tax. And they give an example. So for a Black homeowner in Bridgeport, Connecticut, for instance, if they had a home valued at $340,000, the annual rebate would be $1,800. As a solution goes, what do you guys think about that one as a recommendation? Actually, putting a number on what Black folks had in terms of underdevelopment from living in redline communities, and then actually making an investment in repairing that, giving money directly to Black homeowners.
I think that a lot of places, there's been a lot of numbers around how to, they come up with a figure, right? It's not just with redlining. It's just when you look at the wealth, that was generated for white people by Black labor and displacement of people over time, and, not getting the 40 acres and a mule, all of the things. But if you just do it to homeowners, the problem is that what happens to renters, right? And so, you have to start somewhere. And so I think that the reality is that I think people are not thinking big enough, right? Because you're trying to think about something that's going to be acceptable to the man, so that people aren't going to be up in arms. But the fact of the matter is, like, those numbers that I just saw, like, that's like nothing, right? That's chump change. And it does not really capture the loss of unrealized wealth. Like, as I said,
that number seems really small. Doesn't it to you? 1,800? Because let's think about it. $340,000. I imagine that you need a job that pays 60 to 100K for a house that's 340, maybe somewhere in the 60, 70, 80, you could afford it somewhere. So if you're getting $1,800 a year, it does not feel like that is reparative to the bigger problem.
And even when I looked at the cost of the house, and I was just like, in the communities where I worked in schools, that there were no houses in those neighborhoods that cost that. So where's the significant number? We're talking about like the impact of crushing poverty. What are the values of those homes, right? And so if it's $1,800 for $300-something thousand house, what is it for that $60,000 house that so many people are living in?
It'd be like
And
$100 or
yeah, and
something.
so how does
Yeah.
that a game changer
Well,
for
let me
that
ask this
person's
then.
child and stuff?
Would this be more workable if that number was bigger? Like,
I,
let's say it
I think
was
it's
like
still I think
a
it still has to.
$10,000 a year rebate. Let's say it's $10,000 a year.
But
Would
I
that
still
be more
think
workable
what
still?
Katera brought up was like the masses, the amount of people, like how many in Philadelphia black homeowners are in the 300,000. Where like what is the cost of the home and what would that cost? Because I think when they do it that way, they're like, oh yeah, 300,000. But then when you look at the majority of folks that were in near Turner Middle School, Shaw Middle School, and Shoemaker, that's not their reality, right? And so it still gets, I think it's still that trickle down idea in some ways where like, oh, let's just focus on this group. It's like what you bring up all the time. Like, yes, and our A Black Hands teammates, they frown on every time you say it. But like, yeah, I hear you with loan forgiveness. What about the folks that didn't even graduate high school and like what their lived experiences? What are the ones who, like there's such a significant and yes, like take care of the folks who are trying to further education because that's what we push. Get your degree, right? Like all of that. And there's so many others in our communities that's not their reality. They may see it on the news and be like, how does that help right now, tomorrow morning?
It doesn't help anybody. Like, and then if you don't own a home because your place was redlined, so there was no home, like there's no comps, you can't even get a house in the neighborhood because there's no comps, you can't qualify, whatever. But the fact of the matter is that we should be looking at the loss of wealth, right? So you take this, you pick this neighborhood or wherever, and you do a comp to another neighborhood that was not redlined, with the same income, whatever, and look at the difference in how the home appreciated, like the difference in that percentage, and that's the reparation that you make.
Yeah,
right?
Look at my mom's house in Winfield, and if it crossed the street into Lower Merion, what would it be worth?
Exactly.
Right? So this one, I think, with the tax rebates, I think what our feedback on this one sounds like would be, number one, the rebate's not enough. Number two, giving it to Black homeowners leaves renters out of the picture, and I imagine that renters outsize or have they outnumber Black homeowners in a lot of communities. So this would be like doubling down on giving money to the middle and to the more privileged than the lesser privileged folks. So,
but can I say one thing about that too? I'm sorry to cut you off, but this kind of provides insight into this inequity that continues to be embedded, right? So when you look at housing, right, and home ownership, right? So how I said there's subsidized housing, there's these housing vouchers that could be changed into home ownership, and it's always like these are handouts. But when you think about their tax law, right? And so homeowners get these kind of deductions for the interest that they pay, the real estate taxes that they pay, the homeowners insurance that they pay, if they paid any points on their mortgage. All these become deductions that now that's how we're subsidizing home ownership in this country anyway. So the wealthiest person could take all that interest deduction every year and lower their tax burden. And so now we've kind of taken that same mentality that, because this goes back to this agrarian society, all this kind of society where it's all about home ownership. And we're literally doing the same thing through some bogus reparations that's not even scratching the surface to getting us to where, the reality is that we probably will never get, like they say, like even with some of the representation, I think some of the numbers came out that it really is $300,000 per Black person. And we know that's not, because some of these white people, like they have billions of dollars from what, like from stealing stuff, back during the times of railroads and all that kind of stuff. And so we're never going to crush it. It's even if we did reparations now and said, okay, clean slate, everything's equal. We're going to do equal schools, we're going to do all this stuff, because all this stuff we are talking about is like symptoms of this larger problem, right? So the problems in the schools, how you're kind of saying like we should be looking larger for some of this movement stuff. It's like all of this stuff kind of goes back to the fact of the matter is that Black people are less than, and we can't have nothing, right? So that's really what it comes down to. And so
the point of origin for and this is like important for activism and for focus, for movement focus, if you like try and trace an issue back to its roots and its root causes, everything that we're talking about in this today are the systemic places where you can go back to and find it. Like if I wanted to find out how all the downstream health issues and, you know, loss of wealth and all that type of stuff that create higher rates of hypertension and lower birth weight and all of these type of things, if I wanted to go really upstream, I would find them in places like this, and then I would attack them. I would attack this place. I love what you're saying here, because I think this is good feedback for Dr. Green and Dr. Baker to socialize these ideas that they have with folks like us and others to say, can we talk about maybe what are you thinking about what this does for people who rent? What does this do for the landlord system? What does a $1,800 a year tax rebate to somebody who has a $340,000 house do for the person who has a $8,000 a year income and is renting on Section 8 somewhere? I don't know that this is really reparative. I think it's not a bad idea. Tax rebates to Black homeowners as a wealth builder is not a bad idea. I don't know this is the silver bullet recommendation that should be number one in your reparations proposal. Their second one is around closing gaps in district revenues, because we know in a lot of states that that Black children, because where they live and tax bases, aren't getting the same revenue. So what they're proposing here is to close the gap on what Black students and Black communities would get in terms of state aid. Again, does that feel like one to you that is up to the cause of reparations when we use the word reparations?
I think 2 and 3 and 4, like I think all of those are in the same bucket in school finance. And you look at Pennsylvania, which has one of the worst school funding, and they'll say, look, no, Pennsylvania, there's a state we give a whole lot of money. But when you look at poverty, immigration, dual language, all of those things, and the Black and browner you are, and you can see it, even if it's a poor white district and a poor brown Black district next to each other, the Blacker you are, the less money you're going to receive, right?
Even in the same district.
Yeah, and it's even, I mean,
yeah.
And it's absolutely crazy, even when you look at how they are able to protect their communities. So in a white, rural area can lose population, but they still get the same amount of funding for their school. Let that be somewhere else where the Black community, like, oh, you lost that, so that money is getting snatched out of your budget. But they're able to do this thing where every year the new budget is like, do no harm, right? And so, and they think about it, again, just same way with that CR, it's the same stuff. The CRT thing, like, oh, we don't want white kids to feel uncomfortable. Oh, yeah, our district has shrunk to half the size, but we don't want them to be uncomfortable, right? All of these things on the backs of other folks. I think that school fine. I do think number one should be, what does it look like? And if we're going to make investment, not 1,800, like that figure that Katera said, like, right? Because wealth is also about being able to invest. It's going to be hard to invest $1,800 a year.
I find so
300,000 you could, with some financial literacy courses and stuff like that.
I'm going to ask Dr. Green and Dr. Baker to come on and discuss this.
I would love that.
I think we should unpack it for the community, because I do think their headline, how reparations can be paid through school finance reform, is interesting to me. The headline grabs my attention because we need some educational reparations package, which we don't have. And I do think that people would be, many people in leadership don't want to talk about reparations broadly, but they might be able to be encouraged to talk about it in education, which to me is a central location of everything we care about, because it's where our children are and where they lived, and they're being robbed right now. We know that 8 million Black children are being robbed by the system. But if you're going to call it reparations, it seems like it would need to be a bit more ambitious than talking about tax rebates for homeowners, maybe a $1,600 gap closing of per pupil income. I mean, $1,500 per kid, that's a lot. That's decent, but I don't know, it fits in the scheme of reparations. The other things that they had here, change how race factors are in school aid formulas, eliminate racism in school finance formulas. So it's on a track, but help me out here. Am I wrong to say that none of this that I just said in their reparations plan is disturbing the boundaries?
It's not. They're
and the
trying to make it
lines.
palatable. Like they wanted to, because they wanted to. They want to. A lot of times, people propose stuff that's passable. Like, oh, people won't complain too much about this, but it's like it needs to be bigger, right? And I think that this goes back to what Sharif keeps saying about white people's comfort, right? So white people are uncomfortable with reparations, so you can't propose something bigger than $1,800, or white people are going to be uncomfortable, as you said. So we can't talk about CRT, and this white discomfort is what keeps it like. White people are uncomfortable with the fact that Black people might have land. And so when we have Reconstruction, it's because white people were uncomfortable. White people are uncomfortable with Black excellence. Then we have the Tulsa race riot. You know what I mean? Like, so it's this all this kind of where every move that we got to make in this country is about. Let me just calm down a little bit.
No, don't.
Get hyped. Get hyped.
You're on the wrong show to calm down.
Every move we make has to be to make white people comfortable at the expense of Black people and Black kids. So it's like, as long as that's the barometer, is white people can't be uncomfortable, then we're never going. It's like it's a lose-lose, because we have seen through history that they're never comfortable with any Black, because uppity Black Negroes, they got to be, whatever we get, like that's going to be a problem. And so
let me ask you this though: do you think that part of it too is that people are making the calculations of what they can pass?
Yeah, that's what it is. It is like, can we, people
can we get this through? Because right now we're not getting anything through. So, I mean, maybe in some cases it's like, can you get baby steps through even then?
Right.
Like
it
if we
beats a
can't
blank.
get, like, because even these might add up. This is why I'm interested in having Dr. Preston and Dr. Baker on to talk it through, because they are very policy focused and research focused, but I'm wondering if they think that these are small things that you can introduce into the system and get passed that would have a big impact, like almost like a clever strategy, like these little bites. If you actually did them and got them through, would have that maybe research would tell us they have an outsized impact that I'm not seeing, that I wouldn't be able to see without seeing the data and the research. And even if I saw the data and research, I don't understand it enough to know whether like I believe it. Feels small to me. And the thing that I want to see happen is that we change these boundaries and we change the lines. Like I had a PhD once tell me that the fairest way to enroll kids into schools is with an algorithm, a computer algorithm that gave people no choice of like where they were going to go to school. And if you put an equity algorithm into assignment, just basically said, we're going to place people in a way that takes everything we just said into account. Like we're not going to have opportunity hoarding or whatnot. First of all, everybody would abandon the public education system right now, because a good number of the people who will stand, I'll go to public schools, I'll go to public education. The reason they love it is because they're living on one of the privilege islands. They're living on one of the islands of privilege, right? Yeah. And if you had an algorithm that took that away from them, that said, no, we're going to distribute kids, teachers, resources, and everything in a way that the computer algorithm, that's an equity algorithm, tells us to do, they would abandon these schools.
You're talking about right now, the Great Black Migration is like the largest, migration of people. You would see that trumped by the white folks. The Great White Migration, like you thought suburban flight was big, man.
You know what? Private schooling would be,
man, that would explode, right?
Yes,
Catholic schools wouldn't be talking about we're losing money.
Nobody would.
The suburban rings and the X rings and the man.
You know what? This is the other thing. So, because you guys are making me hit on a couple of points with their proposal. We have to ask why questions. Why instead of giving me an $1,800 rebate, why are schools funded by local tax properties in the first place?
Yes.
Why? We know why. We already said
why isn't that just the state? So a radical proposal would be, no, the state pays for education, not your local tax, because local taxes is inherently inequitable.
And if you see a suburban district like up it and say, oh, we got all these mansions, Lower Merion's like one of the wealthiest places, Montgomery County, like all of that, and you see them up it, your state responsibility is like, you know what, we are balancing that because we're up, right? Like, and it has to be some kind of way, right? You go to these places, and we've talked about this, like nobody knows this more than the science club. I remember, and I knew it in, essentially as a kid, but when I was in the science club and Miss Barnes took us wherever she took us, and we saw that school, in their science labs, and then we were just like how? Like, and of course, I didn't know about I just knew like, oh, white folks usually get better stuff institutionally, so I knew that as a concept. But as far as then later on as an educator to see like, oh, here's the difference between per pupil and everything else, like that was, it just explained everything. So I like your question of fundamentally the why, and even the why applying to the thing. Like, okay, if it's 1800, why? What exactly does it mitigate? You know what I mean? Like, what exactly are you trying to address, and does that do that?
I actually think we're going to have to continue this conversation. Dr. Katera Moore, will you please come back?
Sure.
Yeah, I didn't even realize what time it was. Appreciate that.
Not at a drop of a dime's notice next time. Like,
next time, no.
Literally 5 minutes. I had like 5 minutes notice. I was coming out of the doctor's office.
And you provided so much light and sunshine on this issue. This is the thing this is the beauty of relationships, is that Sharif can call somebody with such expertise on short notice and to help us understand. But what I want to do is, the reason I want you to come back is because first of all, I want tangible solutions, things we can talk about that are like real solutions. And I would love to bring Dr. Baker and Dr. Preston back to give a good reading of their actual proposal, and to have you and Sharif and us discuss like what thinking big would look like, so that we could clarify. For me, honestly, we hit it in this conversation, but I don't think that's the end all be all of discussions. But in terms of gentrification, redlining, we have to ask questions like, who has the power to do that? And are we paying enough attention to them? And when I say paying attention, I mean, are we helping them either do the right thing or leave? Like, are we helping them to understand the truth as God would have them understand it? Or are we helping them understand unemployment? Because our leaders are doing this to us right now. Our so-called leaders, our elected and appointed officials, literally have the power to determine how these lines are drawn. And they're drawing them in ways right now that's killing us. Mm-hmm. They're killing 8 million Black minds. They're killing the parents of those 8 million Black minds. They're zoning us into low birth weight and lead in the water and health outcomes that nobody wants or wants to have, and to a continuation of melanin, the connection between melanin, land, power, and wealth. They're continuing that history, even in 2021, when we got Jay-Z's in the world, and we've got, Oprah's of the world, and we got this entire. They love to show that part, but they don't love to show the part that the Black working class is catching hell like they've always caught hell. And that should
by design.
It's by design. Thank you. Absolutely by design. So we need to undesign some things. Right. That's what our movement needs to be about. We need to get out of these silly battles about whether or not Ariana Grande or somebody said something racist that we need to cancel her for. And we need to start canceling these lines, start canceling these boundaries and these people who draw the lines. Any final words from you two on, to our people who listen and watch, our family who love these discussions? What's the Black message on a Friday from y'all? Look at that. Put you on the spot. Put you on the spot.
I mean, I think that really is just really becoming aware of your place, right? And so when you're looking at something, I say like unpack the symptom, right? We look at the symptom and then like look at the body, like see what's going on in your community. Like ultimately it's if you live somewhere, you have to kind of know what's happening here, and then how can you who can you hold accountable, or how can you, really get involved in what's going on? It might be in the political process. It might be with land use, with your city planning commission, with zoning, or with your school board or whatever. And it's really just to kind of figure out who's making the decisions, and then how you can hold them accountable, or how you can in fact become a decision maker. I think that's truly the key, because a lot of this stuff like we see, and it can be overwhelming. Like, when you have, like the school situation is just, it's heartbreaking. And it's like, what are you going to do? And so kind of thinking about where you can take action, but in order to take action, you have to kind of know what's happening on the ground. And then I guess kind of lose the distractions of all this other crap that's happening on social media, and pay attention to, the real things. So that stuff is a distraction designed to keep you off task of these bigger issues.
I love that. Thank you so much for coming on today. Sharif, you have any final words for Black World?
Now, I definitely double down on the idea Dr. Moore talked about with distraction. And I like your earlier comment that I've really been haven't stopped thinking about, Chris, was really, what are the goals? Like what, if folks were sitting in a church basements and coming up, here's the most important lever we can push and challenge, and we're going to do it all these different angles. What is that today? And I think particularly, how do we do that in a way that centers uh, Black children and Black students in particular? And what are those levers? What are the 2 or 3 things, no matter what? If you still want to do the social media, Ariana Grande, whatever, like, okay, fine. But that's maybe 10% of your time. 90% is on this other thing that we are all agreeing upon. And ever since we started talking, I can't get this one image out of my mind, is that you never see that famous painting of Manifest Destiny. You got the white angel floating above the covered wagons and all that kind of stuff. That's what a lot of this reminds me. Like, it's always been protecting white space, white privilege, white power, white wealth. And now that's just being, you see it in so many different instances. That's what it is. And to hell with everybody else's kids is what their policies scream. And so that's where we just can't ignore that. Like, we got to get these policies, and as you said, recreate them.
I love it. Thank you all for coming on today. Thank you to our friends and family who've been watching, our normal viewers. And by normal, I don't mean normal in affect, but I mean regular, coming back to us again and again and again. You all are so important, because conversation, dialogue, action, plans, information, all of this stuff is the movement. That is what we need to be engaged in on a regular basis. 8 million Black children, 13 million brown children, and many more children in poverty and in other circumstances are not getting the best out of our systems. As adults, we need to use all the brains and the mind that have been given to us by nature and by God to put on the problem in the best places to put it in the problem. And right now, what we talked about today is much clearer to me than arguing about single instances of racism. We have an entire system to dismantle, and we can't do that without knowing the blueprint. Show me how the system is designed. Show me where the lines are. Show me the boundaries, because I can't dismantle what I don't understand. So let's start understanding these things. Let's start looking to experts like these, who spend their time, energy, and educational lives with a bunch of fancy book learning. Ha ha ha! See how I got that in there? A bunch of fancy book learning to understand these things, because the rest of us need to be looking at them like oracles and sages. Like, when you went and read on that, tell me what you discovered. That's what this is about. So thank you all. This has been another episode of Freedom Friday, and you are still not free, but hopefully you are freer after an hour with us than you were when you began. We will be back next week to discuss to continue the conversation that we have every week, which is how do we free the minds of our 8 million Black children. Thank you all so much for watching. Please, if you like the show, share it with a friend.